I'm not responsible for conflict in the United States. It's almost a stupid answer. It's so obvious. Obviously, it's a war between the North and the South. Now there are different theories about this sectional conflict, and there are the Beards. Charles and Mary Beard have the famous thesis that this is about a capitalist, bourgeois. They use this kind of Marxist analysis. Northern society that is at odds with this old feudal or agrarian agricultural South. They have fundamentally different economies. These economies generate different kind of political values, political systems, and different cultures. And this cultural clash is basically what drives this sectional conflict throughout U.S. history. So, fundamentally, we have fundamentally different economic systems, and I think that's hard to avoid. We see that in the tariff disputes in the early 19th century. Matter of fact, the first example of nullification, well, the first example is the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that come up with the Alien and Sedition Acts. But later on, we see nullification coming up as an issue with tariff issues. Now, the South is exporting cotton. The North is trying to manufacture goods in competition with Great Britain. The North likes protective tariffs. When protective tariffs go up, the Southerners, who import everything and export cotton, they're screwed. So the Southerners naturally hate tariffs. They'd rather have no tariffs. But they basically can't swing that. They're basically, and that's where we see the first threat of secession from the South is actually on the issue of tariff issues in the 1820s. And that's where I think some of you can remember the Tariff of Abominations and all these tariff. Tariff is a very boring subject, but it is the first sort of issue that is really a sectional issue, where we see this issue of nullification of secession coming up. Slavery has been an issue since the Constitution, and it goes all the way back to the Three-Fifths Compromise. And we see, we basically agreed that we were going to get rid of slavery by 1808. We we're going to end the importation of slaves. After 1808, remember, all the slaves in the United States are basically homebred. You can trade within the United States. You have to grow your own, basically, with slaves. The other issue that comes up as we go on, that's really sort of exacerbating the sectional tension as we get to the Civil War, is the fact that the United States is expanding territorially throughout this early history. And every time, and in the beginning of this territorial expansion, we're basically we had the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance happens during the Articles of Confederation. That's one of the pieces of legislation during the Articles of Confederation that has, gold standard. That's the great achievement of the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution. We basically do two things. We institute a proper chain that with the Constitution, and it bans slavery above the Ohio River. It bans slavery, which means that all of the southern states that become slave states, this is never a national issue because Georgia and North Carolina basically have territories that expand all the way west, and basically, Kentucky and Alabama and Mississippi, those are basically chunks of territory that are chopped off of Georgia's land. These were never territories of the United States. These are actually part of states that already had slavery. So adding slavery to those states was never a federal issue. That was not a federal issue. Where we come into where the thing starts to heat up is when we get the Missouri Compromise, and then when Missouri wants to enter as a slave state, we have the Missouri Compromise where we crack Maine off of Massachusetts. We have to maintain a balance of power in the Senate. That's what we're looking for. The Southerners know that they have no chance in the House of Representatives. They do not have the population. The representation in the House of Representatives is proportional population. They do not have the population to win the House of Representatives. That's lost to them. However, they can make a stand in the Senate. They can maintain, because 2 senators per state, as long as we have a balance of southern states or slave states and non-slave states, we can maintain a balance of power in the Senate. And with the Louisiana Purchase and Missouri coming in as a state, Missouri could come in as a slave state. We'll crack Massachusetts and create another northern state called Maine. So we'll have 2 senators from Maine, 2 senators from Missouri. We'll maintain that balance. And then sort of the southern boundary of Missouri, 3630, is going to be a line by which slavery isn't going to exist north of that. So that's sort of the compromise they pulled. We're basically, through this territorial expansion, every time the United States expands, this issue of sectionalism, and this is because these are now territories. Territories are managed by the federal government. These are not things that are cracked off the states. The federal government has to weigh in and sort of make a decision here. So Louisiana purchased the Missouri Compromise, and then later on, we've got this issue of popular sovereignty, which is, you know, Stephen Douglas. It's actually a guy named Lewis Cass who sort of invents it. But this idea that, you know, there's this desperate attempt. There's a desperate attempt going on that if we can just get this slavery issue out of the Senate, out of the federal government, because it threatens to tear the system apart. It threatens secession and civil war. If we can get it out of the politics of the national government and back to the states, maybe we can avoid a civil war. And so popular sovereignty in a way is a way, well, we'll take it out of the hands of the federal government. We'll let the people in the states decide. You know, we'll just have a vote. And every time a state territory becomes a state, we'll have it or not, and that'll be it. It won't be this big deal that threatens to create civil war and all this. Well, and that's basically what's behind, and we can see that's what's behind the popular sovereignty idea. That's behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And actually, it becomes even more popular with Dred Scott, because the Dred Scott case basically states that slaves aren't citizens, and the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Remember, there's Dred Scott is the second Supreme Court case where judicial review is invoked that declares a law passed by Congress unconstitutional. The first one's Marbury versus Madison. The second one's Dred Scott. Dred Scott basically means the Missouri Compromise is gone. Compromise that we've sort of hammered out and lived by. But the problem is, popular sovereignty leads to civil war in Kansas. And it leads to this Lecompton Constitution, which is a very corrupt constitution that's, you know, one of the things that's going to polarize people around the election of 1860. But this idea of popular sovereignty is something that they're going to ask you questions about this. They're going to ask you questions about the Northwest Ordinance. They're going to ask questions about the Three-Fifths Compromise, probably, or the Great Compromise in the Constitution. They'll probably ask you questions that deal with nullification, whether they are Kentucky and Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, whether they're tariff issues, that's Calhoun's thing, you know. So these topics, you're going to get a multiple choice question on them. When we get the Mexican-American War and all those western states pile in, half of Mexico becomes the United States, this whole issue of territorial expansion comes again. Wilmot Treviso is he's basically suggesting that none of the new territories that we win through the Mexican-American War will ever become slave states. That doesn't pass. That's trouble with the South, obviously. The South is never going to go for that. The Compromise of 1850 is the one where they basically allow California to come in as a non-slave state, and they strengthen the fugitive slave law, and they have a few other things. All of these attempts to create compromises and avoid civil war, they pound you on. You have to know all of those on the test. I don't know which one I don't know which ones they're going to ask you, but they could ask you all of them. A multiple choice question. So you have to know all of them. And the Clayton Compromise is generally viewed as the last attempt to avoid civil war. Remember, Abraham Lincoln is elected as President of the United States. The Republican Party's platform in the 1860s is the southern states where slavery exists can continue to have slavery, but it will not expand from that point at all.